It's not often that I keep up with ongoing comic books. The industry has become so oversaturated with inconsistent and forgettable titles that even for super avid comic readers like me, it's a headache to try and keep track of what's worth your time and money each month, and what's worth waiting for the trades, and what's worth absolutely nothing from you at all. But recently, an ongoing actually grabbed my attention. An ongoing with a character that I never really expected to grab my attention. Absolute Martian Manhunter debuted in March of 2025, and since seeing the cover of issue number 1 in my local comic shop, I've been absolutely hooked. The story of this book is really gripping. The art is stunning, surrealist and otherworldly, cartoonish yet haunting, a strange mix of noir blues and grays with psychedelic rainbows and swirls. It's genuinely one of the most memorable and striking art styles I've seen from a comic book, let alone a mainstream superhero comic book, in years. And thankfully, for once, I'm not just being a contrarian. It appears that this is the general consensus amongst readers, as not only is the online comic community praising this book as much as I am, but it's also selling remarkably well. Absolute Martian Manhunter number 1 was the 4th most sold comic in March, beaten only by Batman and the other Absolute debut that month, Absolute Flash. Just think about how insane that is. Martian Manhunter, a B-list character at best, sold better than Superman, Wolverine, Wonder Woman, even Spider-Man. And just in July, the 5th issue of the series still managed to stay in the top 10 with the likes of Godzilla and Marvel Goonerbait. But that's not all. After reading the first issue and being blown away, I looked up the author, some dude named Deniz Camp, who I had never heard of, only to realize that he's also currently writing the Ultimates, the flagship series in Marvel's new Ultimate Universe line, a series that has also been topping the charts in the last year. And on top of that, he's also currently writing an indie anthology series at Image Comics. This is a man who seemingly came out of nowhere and is now writing important ongoings at both Marvel, DC, and Image, all at the same time. How the hell did this happen? And who the hell is this guy? Born in the Philippines and raised in America by Turkish and Filipino immigrants, Deniz Camp had an appreciation for comics from a young age. It wasn't until he found the character of Superman that Camp fell in love with comics. The dual immigrant identity of Clark Kent and Kal-El was relatable to him. Camp also cites Jack Kirby's New Gods as starting his love for comics, and it's not hard to see why. I mean, the entire Fourth World Kirby saga is exceptional, so definitely go read that, by the way. But Camp made an observation in this interview with panelpatter.com that I think is core to understanding and appreciating his work going forward. The first comic I can remember buying was an old black and white New Gods reprint by Jack Kirby. I'd get on my parents' infinite king-size bed and read there, lost in sci-fi Shakespearean drama. It was the sort of thing you couldn't and can't experience in any other medium, even today. The scale and literacy and imagination of it, even uncolored, I thought it was the most incredible thing I had ever read. That right there, the idea that Kirby created this fantastical universe that simply can't be replicated in any other medium, whether it be prose or film or TV or animation, that the medium of comics is the only way to tell this specific story, that is essential to understanding Camp's mindset when looking at his writing. His career got a bit of a kickstart in 2015 when he won an entry in the first Miller World Annual, a comics writing contest hosted by Kick-Ass and Old Man Logan author Mark Miller. To enter, contestants needed to write a comic starring one of Miller's original characters, and the winners would be officially published in the annual issue. Camp wrote a comic starring Miller's Starlight, and he won. After Miller World, Camp launched his first ongoing, Maxwell's Demons, at Vault Comics in 2017. This series is really dope, but although critically acclaimed, it didn't make much of a splash and only lasted 5 issues. Camp, although a promising writer, wouldn't publish another comic for the next few years, and based on what I've read and listened to, it was in this time period that Camp's ideology that informs his current work fully crystallized. Because while his books stopped getting published, as we all know, in 2020, the world also stopped. Stuck in quarantine, Camp saw the world around him collapsing in on itself. With nothing to do in isolation but watch the news and doom scroll, the never-ending horrors of the world became unavoidable. This existential dread, the overwhelming sense that everything was ending, only further cemented a feeling that Camp had had for years. Shit is pretty fucked.
Everything seemed to be happening at once and kind of dragging us into hell, frankly. And you know, that was really crystallized with the pandemic, but it had started long before that. And this was the feeling that a lot of my friends and I were talking about, and I didn't see represented so well in the media.
So, faced with the realization that the country, and truthfully much of the world, is not just at a turning point, but well past that turning point and headed 90 miles per hour towards certain doom, Camp did what all great artists do in crisis. He wrote. This is especially relatable to me because as a great artist, during the pandemic, I decided to binge and finish the entirety of the Arrowverse. Yeah, that was a good use of my time. But Deniz started to write not only the beginnings of the script for what would eventually become the anthology series he just published this year, but also continued and finished writing his first widely successful book. The first book Camp published that I think helps us in understanding his worldview and what makes him such an essential modern writer. That being 2022's 20th Century Men. Camp's alternate history story of war and imperialism and rebellion is, in my opinion, one of the thematically densest comics of the 2020s. Absolutely elevated by Stephen Morian's artwork, this book really deserves an entire video on its own. So let me know in the comments if you'd like that, because today I don't want to get into any spoilers, I just want to convince you guys to read this damn thing. To try and simplify it, 20th Century Men is a war epic set in the 1980s Soviet-occupied Afghanistan, and follows a handful of characters who come from extremely different backgrounds. One, the Iron Star, or Peter Platonov, a sort of Iron Man riff that is the literal iron fist of the Soviet Union. Another, Thomas Good, a super soldier who served in World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. Another, Azra, an Afghan woman whose true motivations and plans are not immediately revealed to us, but soon become the key to unlocking the heart of this story. Although it is obviously set in an alternate timeline from ours, as our reality doesn't have super soldiers or Iron Men, the comic still does speak truth through its panels, and its depiction of the brutality of Western meddling in the Middle East, portraying the real-life Soviet occupation of Afghanistan that, in this book, leads to the fictionalized war between America, the Soviet Union, and the US-funded Afghan Mujahideen. Camp is less interested here in the political movements of the states, as he is in the actions of its people. Every faction, every nation in this book has fully fleshed out characters. Human beings who are, at the end of the day, independent agents who just happen to be born into entirely different circumstances. Yes, Camp takes the time to humanize even the most monstrous tools of imperialism here. He makes sure that these seemingly larger-than-life figures are never just caricatures. That's not to say Camp doesn't pick a side in this war. He very clearly does, but it's not the side of the Empire, whether it be Russia or the US, and it's not the side of armed religious fundamentalists, whether it be the Mujahideen or the US, because I think the strongest element of this book is how Camp writes the actual citizens of Afghanistan and humanizes their struggle. This is a book that, on the surface, is about two global powers colliding in a land that they have fashioned to be their battleground. But when you keep reading and dig a little deeper, you realize that this book is not about these nations at all. Because although we're following a grand geopolitical conflict, the book rarely gets caught up in the logistics of this war. We don't get clear battle plans or updates on who's winning or who has the strategic advantage. What's America's KD ratio? All we really see is chaos and blood. And I mean, just look at this artwork. Some of the most horrific yet stylized portrayals of war are in these pages, and I think it's something that genuinely could not be portrayed in this way in any other medium. This is a story specifically for comic books. But what this art conveys so well is that this is not the actions of a so-called civilized Western society. This is brutal, barbaric, senseless sadism. And the true victims of this climactic battle of Western thought are the people of Afghanistan. What Camp does with this idea is sort of a spoiler, so I don't want to get into that here. But the great thing about it is that it isn't just pure misery. The Afghans aren't portrayed as just victims, as props to be exploited for some political messaging. There is real beauty in this book. There is strength and love found in the survival of the Afghan people. There is hope amongst the horror. But that hope and beauty makes the cold and brutish acts of the West even more abhorrent, making us as the readers despise them even more, seeing them as the outside invaders, the colonizers that they are. Camp puts us in the perspective of the historically overlooked characters in this piece of history. He humanizes a people that Western media for decades now have written off at best and demonized at worst. Every person on the planet has a story as deep, as complex, and as meaningful as you or I. And yet every day, extraordinary resources are dedicated to convincing us to ignore this natural, healthy empathy impulse. Our news and narratives tend toward misery and violence. They reduce whole peoples to either victims or perpetrators, monsters or bystanders. Presented exclusively with caricatures, it becomes easier to ignore their suffering. Sure, they suffer, but they don't suffer like us. I think that's a tragedy. I think that in the name of humanity, we must make room for complexity. Wherever there are people, there is everything. The good and the bad, the beautiful and the ugly, the holy and the profane. It's all mixed up together. You can't talk about any of it without talking about all of it. 20th Century Men is our attempt, in some small way, to talk about all of it. Okay, this is genuinely radical stuff, and the first time I read it, my mind was kind of blown. Not because I hadn't thought about this brand of anti-colonial politics before, but because I don't think I've seen it portrayed so accurately and unapologetically in American comics in a long time. That's not to say the book is perfect. It's not. There are some growing pains here. The first 2 issues are a little clunky with their pacing, and upon first reading, kind of hard to follow. Camp really loves to use these narration blocks, and in general, I think he uses them very effectively. However, in especially the first issue, he kind of overuses them and places them in awkward positions on the page, breaking up dialogue with internal monologue, which not only slows the pace of the narrative, but also makes it hard to follow along with the crossing interwoven texts here. There's a few plot elements that are overly explained here, in my opinion, and I think would be more powerful if they were just implied and left up to the reader to catch. Camp is generally really great at meeting the reader at their level. He never talks down to you, so when there is something over-explained, it stands out. Thankfully, by issue 3, the book really picks up, and the last 3 issues fully make up for any shortcomings the first 2 had. I got choked up at the final issue, and only a handful of comics have made me cry, so that's a pretty big deal. Again, this is a book that I'd love to make a full analysis on one day, so please, go read 20th Century Men. It's exceptional. This book, as far as I can tell, didn't do exceptionally well financially. I think it did fine for an indie, but the important thing was the people that did read this comic loved it. Deniz Camp became something of an indie darling after this. Kind of a your favorite comic writer's favorite comic writer type thing. And for Camp's career, this book was so important because of that. 2022 was a big year for him, as he not only published 20th Century Men, but also published 2 other indie comics, Agents of World and Bloodshot Unleashed. The latter caught the attention of Sarah Brunstad, an editor working at Marvel Comics, who ended up reaching out to Camp. She offered him a gig writing Children of the Vault, an X-Men miniseries published in 2023. But Brunstad wasn't the only fan of Camp's work at Marvel. That's right, the GOAT Jonathan Hickman was a huge fan of 20th Century Men. With Hickman basically running the show for the new Ultimate Universe at Marvel, he was tasked with finding an author for the new Ultimates line in 2024. And after reading this book, he had found the perfect fit. Closely following Jonathan Hickman's limited event series, Ultimate Invasion, Camp's run on the Ultimates has been nothing short of spectacular. The book follows numerous multiversal variants of Marvel's Earth 616 characters. At first glance, this comic may appear to just be another Avengers run. It's a story of these heroes coming together to fight a group of villains who are ruling the world, led by the main villain of the Ultimate Universe, the Maker. But when I actually sat down and read this thing, I realized it's so much more than that. Let me be hyperbolic here for a minute. I mean, this is a YouTube video after all, so that's kind of my job, but I'm not sure I've read a comic so in tune with the current political and cultural zeitgeist since Watchmen. And that may sound like a ridiculous claim, and maybe it is. Maybe you're in the comments right now calling me a moron. And as this is an ongoing comic, I guess Camp still has the opportunity to mess it up, but so far, pretty much every issue of the Ultimates has not only been wildly entertaining, but also relevant, and in some senses, downright radical. From commentary on the rise of fascism amongst neoliberal incompetence, to criticisms of the pedophilic billionaire class and how they rule every faction of our world, to allegorical condemnations of the genocide in Gaza. This would even be politically radical for an indie comic, so it's honestly kind of mind-blowing seeing this in a mainstream Marvel superhero series. If you don't believe me, to get into very minor spoilers here, a few highlights of the comic for me thus far include Captain America breaking the billionaire president's neck, paralyzing him, America Chavez beating the shit out of cops who are about to kill peaceful protesters, Luke Cage liberating disenfranchised prisoners held in private jails and turning the prisons into reformation and educational centers, and building a revolutionary army out of the liberated prisoners, Iron Lad and the main Ultimate Ultimates, realizing creating a superhero team is not enough to beat the villains of this world. Villains who are not just robbing banks and kidnapping damsels, but villains who have vast wealth and influence. The only way the Ultimates can stand a chance against this supervillain team of dictators and corporate overlords is through a genuine bottom-up revolution, inspiring ordinary people through education, compassion, radical action, and deprogramming efforts.
I know writers who use subtext and they're all cowards.
What makes this Ultimates team so special is they're not really a superhero team at all. Or maybe they're more of a superhero team than what we've come to expect from the genre. They're revolutionaries, whose heroics are portrayed as something that any one of us can replicate in real life. To a degree, of course. I don't expect any of you to be able to fly or anything. I mean, if you can, why are you watching this? It's great reading a comic where the heroes aren't just defending the status quo. In fact, in the 5th issue of the series, we see this Earth's version of Hawkeye, named Charlie, destroying a Roxxon oil refinery, and Captain America fighting to seemingly stop them from doing so. The whole issue is a fight between the two, and we're led to believe that this is going to be yet another story about the neoliberal hero agreeing with the radical leftist ideals, but ultimately disagreeing with their methods. However, the issue has a twist, revealing that Cap is not here to stop Hawkeye, but was simply testing them to make sure that they're up for the task of joining the Ultimates. So the issue ends with Cap and Hawkeye destroying the oil refinery together, and I clapped. It's fitting for our time that this is how our heroes are depicted now. I think the era of status quo defenders is long past, and was never really welcomed by audiences and readers anyway. This comic has struck such a chord with me because Camp's blunt and straightforward commentary feels refreshing. It kind of makes me feel like I'm not going crazy. Camp identifies issues in the real world that we're all facing. He's identified a feeling that we're all having, and is one of the few artists in any medium right now who I believe has 100% accurately captured that feeling and put it into art. It's comforting, but also inspiring. It's rare, especially from mainstream pop culture, but this is a book that actually makes me want to be a better person. It inspires me to not only pay more attention to the world around me, but to also do more to help things get better. So all this to say, read this book too. And that brings us into the next stage of Camp's career. After landing a successful ongoing gig with Marvel in their Ultimate line, Deniz was offered another job, but this one was at DC Comics. Similar to Marvel, in 2024, DC had launched their new Absolute line, with instant bestsellers like Absolute Batman, Wonder Woman, and Superman, kicking off this new alternate universe of stories. And in early 2025, DC was ready to launch Phase 2 of the Absolute Universe, with Absolute Flash, Green Lantern, and Deniz Camp's new ongoing Martian Manhunter. But before we get into a full analysis of that, it should be mentioned that at the same time, Camp was launching another series that he had been conceptualizing and writing since all the way back in 2020 when he was stuck in quarantine, forced to recognize the catastrophic nature of this current moment. So, in March of 2025, you could pick up, for the first time ever, 3 new issues, all written by Deniz Camp. The third was the debut issue of the Image Comics anthology series, Assorted Crisis Events.
I was really looking for a way to talk about the world that I saw around me, which was a world kind of in crisis, in constant crisis, but not one crisis, but rather one crisis just seemed to bleed into the next crisis and they seemed to overlap. I wanted to do a book that felt like it was talking about the world around me and was talking about the people and the things that they were going through around me and the things that I was going through. And so this is my, probably my most personal book, and it's, it ripped right from me and kind of how I see the world.
Assorted Crisis Events is a sci-fi anthology series following loosely connected stories and characters who live in a world that has been lost to time, literally. The narratives revolve around this concept of time itself collapsing, so all different time periods are kind of just mushed into one. And you can see this with something simple like a T-Rex or a Viking showing up in 2025, but also through more cerebral concepts like losing one's own perception of time. Each character experiences these crises differently, making each issue completely unique and unexpected. This is another book I want to make a full video on, so I won't go much into plot details here, but I can pretty confidently say that Assorted Crisis Events is the best indie comic of the year. Image Comics just released a trade paperback for the first 5 issues, and I can't recommend it enough. With beautiful art by Eric Zawadzki and striking colors by Jordi Belair, each issue sees Camp Camp's writing elevated through this artistic collaboration. There's pages in here that have such unique and even abstract panel layouts. Camp and his team utilize the gaps between each page, between each panel, to literally transport us forward and backwards through time. That's kind of a hard concept to explain, so I'll just show you a few pages from issue 2, which is probably my favorite so far, so you can see what I mean. We follow Jesus, an immigrant who works at a factory meat farm, through different periods in his life. We see him as a child with his parents, crossing the border to the US. We see him as a grown man, working with his father in the factory. We see him at his father's funeral, comforting his grieving mother. But what we start to realize as we read is that Jesus is experiencing these moments in time in the exact same way as we are. He is literally being transported from moment to moment, lost in time. Or maybe he's experiencing all of it all at once. Camp visualizes this by ending and starting each page with a sort of visual rhyme, the panels shortening in length and the subject sliding out of view, and then back into view in the new time period on the next page. It's kind of difficult to grasp what exactly is going on at first, and I think that's entirely intentional. This issue took me about 2 read-throughs to fully appreciate what the artists were going for here, and especially on the second reading, I picked up on a lot of little details that elevate the story. But this storytelling technique is not just a gimmick. Camp isn't jumping from future to past to present simply because he can. He's doing it to drive home a thematic point, because overall, Assorted Crisis Events is about displacement. The characters we follow in these stories are largely marginalized and without safety nets, without a home, without a nation, without a sense of security. Camp uses this sci-fi concept of being displaced in time to tell these tragically real stories. Stories that are now more relevant than ever before. Again, back to issue 2, Jesus' horrifying plight of being lost in time, lost in his own memories, mirrors him being lost in a country that is not his native home. A country that won't allow him to simply live peacefully. A country that, under capitalism, treats him and his body like nothing more than a sack of meat to be exploited for labor and then tossed aside to rot when he is no longer useful. Jesus is no different than the animals he has to slaughter for work. He's just one ultimately insignificant cog in this dystopian assembly line of violence. In the United States right now, we're seeing this play out in real time. Although many farmers and even companies are trying to lobby the Trump administration to slow down on deportations and detainment of undocumented immigrants, the administration is showing no signs of stopping. And one of the heartbreaking things about this is that the companies that are advocating for ICE to slow down deportations are doing it purely out of an economic incentive, obviously. They don't want to deport or kill the immigrants. They simply want to have an exploitable working class that can be leveraged to doing more labor for less pay. There is, besides the people themselves, no powerful force in the states that are advocating for immigrant rights on the grounds that immigrants are human beings. The humanity of migrants has been completely discounted, thanks to decades of conservative propaganda and decades of Democrats and liberals taking the conservative talking points at face value and sane-washing them. We have completely normalized a culture of othering and xenophobia. Issue 2 of Assorted Crisis Events is so special to me because Camp explores how migrant labor has been exploited for decades, all leading up to this cruel systemic violence being committed against immigrants today. But he explores it through a humanist lens, first and foremost. The pivotal focus of the comic is Jesus' perspective. We feel the things he feels. We see the world that is turned against him as he sees it. The entire series is a really important work in my opinion and might just be Camp's best comic yet. Like I said, this book really deserves its own video, so please give it a read and comment if you want to see a full analysis of it. But until then, let's finally talk about the comic that got me hooked on Deniz Camp's writing. We've used the word radical a lot in this video. It might even be in the title or thumbnail. And so far, it's been used to describe Camp's politics. But Absolute Martian Manhunter is radical in a different way. Although the political aspect of this book is still on point and important to the text, I want to focus on how the comic's composition and form is radical in and of itself. Just looking at the first issue, we see how Camp and artist Javier Rodriguez used the medium of comics to its fullest potential to tell this story. This is truly a narrative that cannot be told in in the exact same way in any other medium. The visual language of this story is solely unique to comic books. The issue starts off with relatively standard panel composition. We meet John Jones, an agent from the FBI's Stochastic Terrorism Task Force, who has just been released from the hospital after a suicide bomber nearly killed him. As you can see, these first few pages, while still stylistic, are relatively grounded. We stick with these deep, contrasty blacks and minimalist background designs, setting the tone for a moody sci-fi noir. The panels are static, consistent, and uniform. Structurally, it's all very traditional and readable, until the Martian starts to show up. You see, when John was nearly killed, the Martian Manhunter, who in this universe is more of an abstract mind parasite than a shape-shifting alien, took possession of John, and now John and the Martian are essentially cerebral roommates bunking in the same body, with the Martian giving John the ability to read people's thoughts. We start getting these brief flashes of abstract, insane colors. It starts off not subtle at all, but jarring, literally interrupting the narrative to show us that what John experiences is vastly different from what the rest of the world does. As we turn the pages and see John lose his connection to reality more and more, the frequency of these psychedelic color panels increases. But that's not all. The panels start to change themselves. The uniform structure of the first few pages phases into an abstract mesh the more the Martian interferes with John's perception, with panel borders melting away, colored thought bubbles and streams leaking out of the boxes, spreading across the entire page. It's the rare comic where every single page in this thing I would frame and hang on my wall. The crazier John's headspace gets, the crazier the compositions get. Just look at these pages near the end of the issue. Even without the story here, without context, this art is just flat out amazing to look at. And my favorite part, hi, by the way, it's me, Mr. Comics, is the very end of this issue, where Camp and Rodriguez go full Silver Age with this final message and tell readers to hold this last page up to a light source to reveal the final image. Martian Manhunter's face superimposed over John's. It's a simple trick, but it boils down why I love this book so much. This is the type of formal stuff that made me love reading comics when I was a kid, and I get a genuine childlike sense of glee when I see just a cool visual trick like this. So many modern comics try to make you forget you're reading a comic book. I love a lot of his books, but notoriously, Geoff Johns writes his comics as if they'll be adapted into a movie or show eventually. Comparatively, this book doesn't give a fuck about adaptations. Camp and Rodriguez have no ambitions here beyond making an awesome comic book. And that extends beyond Martian Manhunter to all of Camp's books. His number one priority with each story is to make the best comic book he can, whether that's by experimenting with visual layout, or bending time and space to the narrative's will, or turning mainstream blockbuster superheroes into leftist revolutionaries, or centering a war epic around the plight of the colonized. Camp is always trying to make something radical. That commitment to consistent quality and experimentation has, in just a few short months, made me a huge fan. And since picking up Martian Manhunter, I've gone back and read his entire body of work. And I'm excited to say that I think he's just getting started. Marvel has announced that this December, Deniz Camp will be the writer on the Ultimate Universe's event series, Ultimate Endgame. This is huge, as this crossover event is going to be a really big moneymaker for Marvel. So the fact that Marvel trusts a writer this bold and this new to the industry to lead the biggest event of the year is a great omen for not just his career, but for the future of comics. It's also amazing that the quality of his newer series are matching the sales numbers. He's not just making great art, he's making great art that people are reading. That's not easy to do. I mean, look at my magnum opus, The Great Apes of DC Comics. It only got like 12K views, but it obviously should have like 13K. I think. And as for the indie scene, Assorted Crisis Events has just been picked up for another 5 issues, so we get some more personal work from Camp soon too. But now that we know how Deniz Camp took over the comic industry, I want to ask why? Why did Deniz Camp get so big all of a sudden? Again, just a few years ago, this guy was a complete unknown. He was advertising his books on Reddit, like respect by the way, my fellow Redditor. Well, I think the answer here is obvious, but maybe overlooked by many other artists. Deniz Camp is fearless. During an interview with CBR.com, Camp explained that, "My thing has always been, let them fire you for trying. Maybe you become a little bit timid. You don't want to rock the boat too much because you're not sure, and you don't want to call too much attention to yourself or too much attention to what you're doing. But I think you need to if you want to make a splash, because there's just so many books out there, and a lot of them are really good. And so if you want to compete with that, then you should be kind of fearless about it, and if nothing else, let Marvel and DC say no. Again, get caught trying. Don't self-censor. When so many artists working within the comic industry and beyond are silencing themselves, sanitizing their beliefs and artistic tastes in order to appeal to a wider audience, and often seeing that effort backfire anyway, an artist like Camp stands out amongst the crowd. In an era where so much entertainment feels like mindless slop produced just to distract, it's refreshing to read something that has a soul.
Thank you, President Donald J. Trump, for securing our border and putting America first.